The sound of Ava's guide dog's paws tapping against the concrete echoed in the cold morning air. She walked through the busy city street, her hand resting lightly on Max's harness, as the world around her buzzed with the energy of commuters. She could feel the vibrations of the city, the constant hum of cars, the murmurs of passing strangers. But it all seemed so far away. Her world was always like this, quiet, yet full of life. Max, her loyal guide dog, had been with her since she was a child. He was her eyes, her protector, her constant companion in a world that sometimes felt too loud, too fast, and too overwhelming. She trusted him with everything, knowing that when she held onto his harness, she was safe. Today, however, something was different. As Ava approached the intersection, she felt Max slow down, his movements more hesitant than usual. Something wasn't right. She paused, gently pulling on the leash. "Max, what's wrong, boy?" she whispered, trying to calm him. But the dog didn't respond to her words. He simply stood there, still and tense, as if sensing an unseen danger. Ava's heart began to race, her intuition telling her that trouble was near. That's when she heard it. The harsh screech of tires on asphalt, the sudden stop of a car right beside her. She tensed, but before she could react, a voice broke through the air. "Hey, watch where you're going!" Ava froze. The voice came from a man standing on the sidewalk, a police officer, judging by the uniform. His tone was sharp, laced with irritation. She didn't need to see his face to know there was a venom in his words, the kind that was all too familiar. Ava, who had grown up navigating a world that often saw her as less than, felt the sting of his words even before she turned to face him. "I'm sorry," she began, her voice steady but soft, hoping to diffuse the tension. "My dog's guiding me, and—" Before she could finish, the officer cut her off with a snide laugh. "Oh, I see. The blind girl with her little guide dog thinks she can walk around here like the rest of us. Well, newsflash. You can't just take up space in the middle of the street. Move along." His eyes narrowed, his posture shifting as if to assert dominance over a situation that didn't need his aggression. Ava felt a knot form in her stomach. Max had never reacted this way before, but now the dog was stiff with tension, his body rigid under her hand. Ava could sense the officer's hostility even before he took another step closer. "Excuse me, officer, I'm just trying to get to the bus stop," Ava said, doing her best to keep her composure. But the officer's presence felt overwhelming, suffocating. His contempt was thick in the air, and it was clear this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. "I don't care where you're going, lady," the officer sneered. He looked down at Max and then, without warning, kicked the dog in the side. Ava's heart stopped. Max yelped in pain, stumbling to the side. Ava instinctively reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed onto his harness, pulling him close to her. The shock was so immediate, so violent, that her breath hitched in her chest. "You don't belong here," the officer spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "You and your dog are nothing but a nuisance. Get out of my sight." Tears burned in Ava's eyes, but she couldn't let them fall. She had to stay strong. She had to stand up for Max, for herself. She couldn't let this man treat her this way. Not again. "Don't you dare touch him again," Ava said, her voice shaking with fury. She reached down, gently checking Max to make sure he was all right, feeling his body tremble beneath her hands. But her words didn't faze the officer. He took another step toward her, his smirk widening, his eyes filled with malicious satisfaction. "What are you going to do about it? Call your senator uncle to save you," he mocked, clearly aware of her family connections. "People like you need to learn their place." Ava's breath caught in her throat. She had known this kind of prejudice her whole life, but it was the first time it had been so blatant, so cruel. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fight back, but instead, all she could do was hold Max close, feeling his pain and her own swell inside her. The world around her blurred as her mind raced with a single thought. This man needed to be held accountable. But how? "Take your dog and get out of here," the officer growled, before turning and walking away with a smug look on his face, leaving Ava and Max in the middle of the street, both stunned and trembling. The moment the officer was out of sight, Ava knelt down, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Max looked up at her with trusting eyes, as if asking for reassurance. She didn't have any answers. Not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was something bigger, something that needed to be exposed. Ava stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. The world had just shown its ugliness to her, but she wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. Not now. Ava stood frozen in the street. The image of the officer's foot making contact with Max still burned in her mind. The pain in her chest was sharp and immediate, both for her dog, her best friend, but also for herself. It wasn't just the physical pain, it was the insult, the humiliation of being treated as less than human, simply because of who she was and the color of her skin. Max whimpered softly beside her, his body still trembling from the attack, and she knelt down, gently stroking his fur. The dog had been her constant companion for years, and now, after everything they had been through together, he had been harmed, for nothing more than the officer's spite. Her hands were still shaking, and she tried to calm herself, but the rage was building inside her. She couldn't just walk away from this. The world had seen injustice like this before. It wasn't new, but it wasn't going to be swept under the rug this time. Ava's uncle, Senator Elijah Carson, had spent years fighting for the rights of people like her. He had stood up for justice, and she knew that now, more than ever, she had to do the same. But even as the determination began to rise within her, Ava understood one painful truth. The system wasn't designed for people like her to win, and she was about to test it. The next steps. That evening, after the incident, Ava returned home, her thoughts clouded with uncertainty. Max was resting on his bed, his body finally starting to relax as she gently rubbed his sides. She sat at the kitchen table, trying to figure out what to do next. Should she report the officer? Should she let it go, like so many others had done? Should she even tell her uncle about what happened? Ava knew that keeping it a secret wouldn't help anyone. She knew the truth needed to come out, but she also knew that it wouldn't be as easy as just speaking up. There would be consequences. There always were. People like her didn't have the luxury of justice. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a text from her uncle, Elijah. "Ava, I need to talk to you. Something's come up. I'll be home in an hour." Her stomach twisted. She'd been hoping to avoid telling him. She knew he would want to make a public statement, to do something drastic. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that, but now, as the minutes ticked by, she realized there was no way to avoid the conversation. A conversation with Uncle Elijah. When her uncle arrived, he immediately noticed the tension in her face, and Max's subdued presence only added to it. Ava sat down in the living room, trying to gather her thoughts, but before she could speak, Elijah began. "What's going on, Ava?" His voice was calm, but filled with an edge of concern. "I've been hearing rumors. What happened today?" Ava hesitated. The weight of what had happened seemed unbearable, and she wasn't sure where to start. She took a deep breath, finally deciding to tell him everything. The words, the insult, the moment that felt like a breaking point. "The officer, he kicked Max," she said, the words sounding too small for what they meant. "He kicked him without any reason, and I was just standing there, trying to keep it together. And he mocked me, called me names, said I was just another black girl with a dog. He said I didn't belong there." Elijah's expression hardened. Ava watched as his face turned from concern to fury. He clenched his jaw, as if holding back a storm. "Did anyone see?" he asked, his tone low and calculating. Ava nodded. "There were a few people, but they didn't do anything. They just watched." Elijah sat back, processing the information. He had spent his life fighting to dismantle the very systems that allowed things like this to happen, and yet even he couldn't shield his niece from this kind of brutality. He stood up abruptly, pacing in front of her. "This isn't just about you, Ava. It's about every single person who has had to face this. This isn't just some isolated incident. This is systemic." Ava's heart sank. She knew what he was thinking. "Uncle Elijah, no. I don't want to make a scene. It's not worth it. It's just one officer. It won't change anything." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a sadness she had never seen before. That's exactly the problem. Every time people like you and me choose to stay quiet, we let them win. We let them get away with it. We can't afford to be silent anymore. You've been hurt, and Max has been hurt, and this isn't something we can just walk away from. Ava looked at her uncle, feeling the weight of his words settle deep within her. But her voice faltered. What if no one believes me? What if nothing changes? Elijah knelt down in front of her, putting a hand on her shoulder. The truth is bigger than any of their lies. The truth is bigger than any of their threats. And I'll be damned if I sit back and let them silence us again. But we need to do this the right way, Ava. I'll be with you every step of the way. We'll make them see who we are. The following days passed in a blur of emotions and decisions. Elijah pushed Ava to file an official report, but the process was slow and filled with resistance from the police department. The officers who had witnessed the incident remained silent, and those who could have helped were too scared of speaking out. Meanwhile, the story spread. News outlets began picking up the story of the officer's attack on a disabled black girl, and Ava's name started to appear in headlines. People from all over the country began reaching out, sending messages of support, but with that attention came the backlash. The comments were harsh, filled with racism, disbelief, and venom. It was just a dog. Why are you making such a big deal? Some said. She's just trying to make a fuss for attention, others claimed. The ugliness of the world she lived in seemed to be magnified in every word, in every post. And yet, Ava refused to let it silence her. Her uncle kept pushing for justice, trying to gather support from within the political system, but every move was met with resistance. The police union issued statements claiming that Officer Hart was simply trying to de-escalate the situation and that he had acted within his rights. They spun the narrative, attempting to frame Ava as an aggressor, as if her very existence in the world, as a black woman with a disability, was a crime in itself. One night, as Ava sat at her desk, reading through the flood of messages and comments, a familiar face appeared on her phone screen. It was Jennings, Officer Hart's partner, the one person who had witnessed the entire incident and had remained silent. His message was short but urgent. Ava didn't hesitate. She met him at a small cafe, her heart racing with anticipation. Jennings was waiting in the corner, looking over his shoulder nervously before nodding at her to sit down. "You're not the only one who's been watching," Jennings said quietly, sliding a folder across the table. "There's more. There's a pattern with Hart. He's been doing this for years, and it's all been covered up." Ava felt her pulse quicken. "What are you talking about?" Jennings sighed, glancing around. "I've been gathering evidence. I can't let him get away with this anymore. You're not the only one he's hurt. There's a trail of victims, and Hart's the common denominator." Ava took the folder in her hands, her heart racing as she opened it. What she saw inside would change everything. Jennings handed over a stack of photos, statements, and recordings. Proof of Hart's long history of racially motivated incidents, of his targeting of disabled people, of his unchecked power within the department. The full extent of Hart's abuse had been hidden, buried by those who feared him. And Ava knew that this was just the beginning. The story wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything the system had done to people like her. People who had been silenced for too long. With the evidence in her hands, Ava made the decision to take her fight public. No more hiding, no more silence. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been targeted, humiliated, and oppressed. And she wasn't going to stop. The days after Ava had met with Officer Jennings felt like an endless blur. A haze of anticipation, fear, and exhaustion settled over her as she tried to make sense of what was happening around her. The world was shifting, but Ava wasn't sure whether it was for better or worse. All she knew was that something had changed inside her. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had learned. The information Jennings had given her was explosive. Officer Hart was not just a rogue cop who had lashed out in the heat of the moment. His actions were part of a larger pattern, a career built on bigotry, brutality, and unchecked power. The evidence, a mix of witness statements, photos, and recordings, painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had used his badge to harm others without consequence. But as Ava pieced everything together, she realized the truth. Officer Hart wasn't working alone. He was part of a system, and that system was protecting him. News of Ava's encounter with Officer Hart and the subsequent investigation into the police officer's history spread like wildfire. At first, there was public outrage. The video of Max being kicked had gone viral, sparking protests, petitions, and discussions across social media. Activists rallied behind Ava, demanding accountability, while some prominent figures, including her uncle Senator Elijah Carson, voiced their support for her courage. But as the days passed, the backlash grew stronger. Those who were invested in the status quo, people with power, money, and influence, began to push back. Ava's name was dragged through the mud by online trolls, and racist slurs flooded her social media accounts. There were calls to cancel her, to dismiss the claims as exaggerated or fabricated. The mainstream media didn't help either. News outlets, desperate for a sensational story, began to muddy the waters, focusing not on the brutality of the incident, but on Ava's background, questioning whether she was truly the victim. Was she really blind? Was she really entitled to the same respect as others? The subtle insinuations of playing the victim were everywhere, reinforcing the notion that Ava didn't belong, not on the streets, not in the world of those who held power. At the same time, the police department began its own campaign of denial. Hart was placed on paid administrative leave, and the department issued a statement claiming that there had been miscommunication between the officer and Ava. The footage of the attack was spun as a misunderstanding, as though the officer had acted out of a misguided attempt to control a dangerous situation. The implication was clear. They were doing everything they could to protect their own. Ava's frustration boiled over. The system, the very system she had always trusted to protect her, was now attacking her for simply telling the truth. And the more they tried to silence her, the more determined she became. Ava's phone buzzed late one evening. It was another message from Jennings. "They're already covering it up. We need to act fast." She had expected the pressure to come, but now that it was here, it felt suffocating. The walls were closing in. It wasn't just the department anymore. It was the entire system. Ava knew that if they didn't act quickly, the truth would be buried under layers of lies and manipulation. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the walls of her apartment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had to go public. But what would happen then? The police would come after her. The people who had been attacking her online would escalate their threats. It wasn't just her life at risk anymore. It was her future. But if she didn't speak up now, nothing would change. It would be business as usual. The truth was bigger than her fear. A few days later, Ava stood at the front of a massive crowd gathered outside the city hall, a mix of activists, community leaders, and people from all walks of life who had come together to support her cause. She had agreed to speak at the rally, to share her story, and to make sure that Officer Hart's actions weren't swept under the rug. Ava had never been one for public speaking. She had always kept a low profile, trying to blend into the world around her. But now, the weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders. The crowd was chanting, calling for justice, but Ava couldn't ignore the pit in her stomach. What if they didn't care? What if, after everything, they still wouldn't listen? She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and stepped up to the microphone. "I didn't ask for this," she began, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I didn't ask to be a symbol. I didn't ask to be here, but here I am. Because every single person who has ever been treated like less, like we don't matter, needs to be heard. And today, I'm speaking for those who have been silenced." The crowd fell silent. Ava could feel the weight of their gaze, all eyes on her. The silence was heavy, like an unspoken agreement that this moment, this truth, was too important to ignore. "I'm not just a blind girl with a dog. I'm not just another statistic. I am a human being, just like everyone else here, and I deserve to be treated with respect. We all do. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who has ever been treated like they don't belong. Every single person who has faced racism, who has faced prejudice, who has been hurt by the system that was meant to protect them." Her heart raced, but she refused. to look away from the crowd. She could feel their energy, their solidarity, and it gave her strength. She continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. When I tried to report what happened to me, they tried to bury it. They tried to make me the villain. They tried to make it seem like this was my fault, like I was the problem. But I'm not the problem, and neither are any of you. The problem is a system that treats us like we're less than. The problem is a system that thinks it can silence us. The crowd erupted in applause, but Ava's heart remained heavy. She had said her piece, but she knew the fight was far from over. There was still so much more to do, so many more battles to fight. The next few days were a blur of media attention, interviews and threats. Ava was still reeling from the attention. The media had taken a twisted turn, with some outlets focusing on her uncle's position, questioning whether she was using his influence to gain traction. Others painted her as a troublemaker, as someone who was simply trying to stir up trouble. Ava spent hours combing through the messages flooding her inbox, some supportive, others filled with hatred. Racist comments were common. "You don't belong in this country," one said. "Go back to where you came from," said another. Ava had been called worse, but every time it happened, it stung a little more. The world didn't see her as just a person. She was a target, a problem, something to be put in a box and dismissed. She had grown up knowing that being a black woman with a disability meant she would always be overlooked, but now it was out in the open, and the response was clear. They didn't want her to exist in a way that challenged their idea of the world, and yet, Ava wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. She spent the following weeks gathering more evidence, working with Jennings, and reaching out to more witnesses. The support grew, but so did the threats. She knew that it was only a matter of time before they tried to silence her for good. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She wouldn't let fear control her. She wouldn't let them make her feel small. The fight had just begun. One evening, as Ava sat in her apartment, her phone buzzed with another message from Jennings. This time, the message was different. "I found something. It's bigger than Hart. You need to see this." Her heart skipped a beat. Jennings had been digging, but she didn't expect him to uncover something so explosive. What was it? What could be bigger than Officer Hart's attack? When Ava met Jennings later that night, he handed her a folder. As she opened it, her eyes widened in disbelief. The documents inside revealed a coordinated effort within the police department to cover up multiple instances of police brutality, all targeting marginalized communities. Officer Hart was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The systemic racism that Ava had always known existed was laid bare before her. "This goes all the way up," Jennings said quietly. "It's not just Hart. It's the whole department." Ava felt a wave of anger rush over her. It wasn't just one officer. It wasn't just one incident. It was a system built on power, prejudice, and fear, and she was going to bring it down. The world was about to learn the truth. Let's take a brief pause here. We'd love to know where you're listening from, and if you've ever had an experience similar to what's been unfolding so far. Your thoughts and experiences are incredibly valuable to us. Please take a moment to share your reflections in the comments below. If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming next. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. Now let's continue. The days after Ava had met with Officer Jennings felt like an endless blur. A haze of anticipation, fear, and exhaustion settled over her as she tried to make sense of what was happening around her. The world was shifting, but Ava wasn't sure whether it was for better or worse. All she knew was that something had changed inside her. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had learned. The information Jennings had given her was explosive. Officer Hart was not just a rogue cop who had lashed out in the heat of the moment. His actions were part of a larger pattern, a career built on bigotry, brutality, and unchecked power. The evidence, a mix of witness statements, photos, and recordings, painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had used his badge to harm others without consequence. But as Ava pieced everything together, she realized the truth. Officer Hart wasn't working alone. He was part of a system, and that system was protecting him. News of Ava's encounter with Officer Hart and the subsequent investigation into the police officer's history spread like wildfire. At first, There was public outrage. The video of Max being kicked had gone viral, sparking protests, petitions, and discussions across social media. Activists rallied behind Ava, demanding accountability, while some prominent figures, including her uncle Senator Elijah Carson, voiced their support for her courage. But as the days passed, the backlash grew stronger. Those who were invested in the status quo, people with power, money, and influence, began to push back. Ava's name was dragged through the mud by online trolls, and racist slurs flooded her social media accounts. There were calls to cancel her, to dismiss the claims as exaggerated or fabricated. The mainstream media didn't help either. News outlets, desperate for a sensational story, began to muddy the waters, focusing not on the brutality of the incident, but on Ava's background, questioning whether she was truly the victim. Was she really blind? Was she really entitled to the same respect as others? The subtle insinuations of playing the victim were everywhere, reinforcing the notion that Ava didn't belong, not on the streets, not in the world of those who held power. At the same time, the police department began its own campaign of denial. Hart was placed on paid administrative leave, and the department issued a statement claiming that there had been miscommunication between the officer and Ava. The footage of the attack was spun as a misunderstanding, as though the officer had acted out of a misguided attempt to control a dangerous situation. The implication was clear. They were doing everything they could to protect their own. Ava's frustration boiled over. The system, the very system she had always trusted to protect her, was now attacking her for simply telling the truth. And the more they tried to silence her, the more determined she became. The following days were a blur of media attention, interviews, and threats. Ava was still reeling from the attention. The media had taken a twisted turn, with some outlets focusing on her uncle's position, questioning whether she was using his influence to gain traction. Others painted her as a troublemaker, as someone who was simply trying to stir up trouble. Ava spent hours combing through the messages flooding her inbox, some supportive, others filled with hatred. Racist comments were common. "You don't belong in this country," one said. "Go back to where you came from," said another. Ava had been called worse in her life, but every time it happened, it stung a little more. The online world, too, had become a battleground. Ava had been called worse in her life, but the sheer weight of these messages, the vitriol in each one, felt overwhelming. And yet, as the anger grew, so did her determination. Ava had spent too long silent, letting others make her feel less than, letting them tell her what she could and couldn't do. But now, it was her turn to speak. It was her turn to expose the truth. The media storm began to shift. Protests erupted in cities across the country. People holding up signs demanding justice for Max, for Ava, and for every other victim of police brutality. News outlets were forced to cover the story, but the narrative was quickly changing from one of victimhood to one of resistance. Ava's story was no longer just a single act of violence against a black woman with a disability. It was about the collective injustice that had been allowed to fester for far too long. But with the growing support came the rising threat. The police department, the powers that be, were not going to let this slide, and Ava knew that the next steps would be the hardest yet. Days turned into weeks. Ava became more vocal, more relentless in her pursuit of justice. The rallies continued. The media covered her every move, and the pressure on the police department began to mount. Ava had received more threats, more hateful messages, but they only strengthened her resolve. She was going to see this through no matter what. One night, as she sat in her apartment reviewing documents, there was a loud knock at the door. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had known this day would come, but now that it was here, she felt an icy fear creep into her bones. She opened the door cautiously, half expecting to see another officer, but instead, it was Jennings. He looked hurried, his face pale. "Ava, you need to get out of here. Now! They're coming for you." "What do you mean?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They know everything. Hart's people. They've been tracking your movements. They're going to try and silence you before you can get the truth out." Jennings was frantic now, pulling her away from the door. "We don't have time. Come on." Ava barely had time to gather her things. Jennings led her through the back door of the apartment complex, where an unmarked car was waiting for them. As they drove away, Ava looked out the window at the city that had once felt like home, but now felt like a foreign, dangerous place. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from her uncle. "Ava, don't do anything reckless. Stay safe. We'll get them. But we need to do this carefully. You've already made a difference. Don't risk everything now." But Ava knew that her uncle, despite his words of caution, understood. He had spent his life fighting for justice, but even he couldn't deny the danger that they were all in now. Ava barely slept that night. The thought of running, hiding, scared her more than anything. But Jennings had been right. There was no turning back. The people who wanted to bury the truth would stop at nothing. Ava knew they would come for her. They would come for Max, but she was ready. Ava wasn't going to run anymore. She was going to fight. The unmarked car sped through the night, its tires skimming across the wet roads as Ava looked out the window, her face pale and tense. The city had become a battlefield in her mind. It was no longer the place she had once loved. A city where she had learned to navigate, a place that once felt familiar, where she walked with confidence and peace. Now, it felt alien and dangerous. The streets, the faces, the places she passed all seemed to judge her with invisible eyes, watching her every move. Jennings kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his knuckles white, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror. Ava's thoughts were a storm inside her head, swirling with uncertainty, fear, and anger. How had it come to this? How had a simple act of cruelty, a policeman kicking her dog, a blind girl just trying to get by, escalated to this war against her? She had thought, for so long, that maybe she could slip under the radar. Maybe the system wouldn't notice her. But now it was too late for that. The messages, the threats, the news stories, the protests, they were all part of something bigger. They weren't just reacting to her. This was the system reacting to itself, protecting its power, trying to silence the truth. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a problem. And the more people stood with her, the more dangerous it became. Jennings turned sharply down an unfamiliar road, the headlights cutting through the night. Ava's heart raced, her thoughts caught in a spiral of panic. She didn't know where they were headed, but every fiber of her being screamed that she had to do something. She had to act, and soon. They reached an apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The building was old, run down, hidden away behind trees and overgrown hedges. No one would think to look here. Jennings parked in an alleyway, out of sight from the main road, before looking over at her. "We're safe here for now," he said, his voice low. "But you can't stay here long. You have to keep moving." Ava nodded, her fingers gripping the edges of her seat. "What now?" she whispered, her voice tight. "What happens next?" Jennings turned off the engine and exhaled slowly. "We fight. We keep the pressure on them. You've already done more than most people would in a lifetime, but now it's about making sure they know you're not going away." Ava's mind was spinning. The truth was on her side, but it didn't feel like that. Truth wasn't enough when the system was so deeply entrenched, when power had so many faces, all masked in different ways. Ava wasn't just fighting Officer Hart. She was fighting a whole system, one built on silencing people like her, people who didn't fit into the mold of what society wanted them to be. She opened the door and stepped out into the cool night, the gravel crunching under her shoes. Max trotted beside her, calm and steady as ever, his presence a small comfort in the midst of all the chaos. Jennings walked ahead of her, leading the way into the apartment building. Ava followed, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about making her voice heard anymore. This was a fight for her life. And she had no choice but to step into the ring. Inside the apartment, the room was dimly lit. The place had an empty, cold feel to it, as if it had been abandoned for years. Papers were scattered across a table, along with a few monitors showing news broadcasts, political speeches, and social media posts. A group of activists, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, were seated around the table. They all looked up when she entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. One of the activists, a woman named Tanya, stepped forward. "Ava, I'm glad you made it here. We've been tracking the news. You're not the only one fighting. There's a whole network of people who've been hurt by this system, people who've been silenced for years. Ava nodded slowly. I know. I've seen it, but I didn't know it was this bad. This corrupt. I thought maybe I could get justice, but I've been too naive. The police are using their power to tear people down. Tanya shook her head, her expression firm. You weren't naive. You were brave. The problem is that when people like us stand up, we're seen as a threat. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone who's ever been oppressed, ignored, or targeted. And that's what scares them. Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. But how do we stop them? How do we make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug again? Tanya looked at her, her eyes filled with resolve. We expose them. We keep fighting. We make sure the world knows what they've been doing. And we don't back down. This isn't just about Hart. It's about the whole system. The thought of it all was overwhelming. Ava had known that her fight wasn't just for herself, but hearing it out loud, the enormity of it, made her stomach twist. She wasn't just fighting an officer. She was fighting a structure that didn't care about her, a structure that didn't care about anyone who wasn't part of its privileged circle. Another voice broke through her thoughts. It was a man named Marcus, a former police officer who had worked in the department before blowing the whistle on its internal corruption. Ava, I've been where you are. I know what it's like to stand up against the system, but you've got to be prepared. It won't be easy. They will try to discredit you, make you look like the enemy. Ava glanced at him. Her curiosity piqued. What do you mean? Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together. They're already doing it. The smear campaigns. They'll call you every name in the book. They'll try to frame you as a criminal. They'll dig into your past, find anything they can to discredit your story, and they'll stop at nothing. You're not just fighting them. You're fighting a machine. Her heart pounded in her chest as Marcus's words sank in. She had known it wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't realized how deep the rot ran. And now she felt the weight of her own vulnerability. She wasn't just some innocent girl who had been mistreated. She was now a symbol, a target, a tool for others to use. The system would come after her, trying to tear her down, trying to shut her up. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything. Ava straightened up, her gaze firm. I'm not afraid of them. I won't let them destroy me. I won't let them destroy Max. And I won't let them silence the truth. This ends now. The room fell silent, everyone watching her, waiting for her next move. It wasn't just the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was the weight of every person who had ever been silenced, every voice that had been drowned out by fear and hate. We fight together, Ava said, her voice steady and strong. We expose them for what they are. We make them see the truth, no matter how many times they try to bury it. The room erupted in applause, and Ava felt a rush of determination surge through her. She wasn't alone in this fight. She was surrounded by people who believed in the cause, people who had suffered just like her, people who were ready to stand together and fight for justice. This was just the beginning, and Ava knew that the harder they fought, the harder the system would push back. But for the first time in her life, she didn't care. She wasn't going to stop. She couldn't stop. The days began to feel like a blur of protests, legal battles, and mounting pressure from every side. Ava had never anticipated that standing up for herself would turn into a battle so relentless, so full of hatred and uncertainty. She had thought that by exposing Officer Hart and the truth behind his actions, things might change, that justice would prevail. But as each day passed, the weight of the fight became heavier, the odds steeper, and the personal toll greater. The media's coverage was a mix of praise and vilification. While the streets were filled with voices calling for justice, Ava knew she was being watched. The eyes of the world were on her, but they were not all kind. She had been painted as a hero by some, a victim by others, but there was always an undercurrent of doubt, a subtle question. Was she exaggerating? Was she playing the race card? Could she really be a victim? Or was she simply another angry black woman making noise? Ava had learned to ignore the comments, the hate, the threats that came with being in the spotlight. But one particular comment, posted by a nameless face in the sea of online voices, stuck with her. Just another lazy girl looking for a handout. It wasn't the first time she had been called lazy, but something about the words stung deeper than she expected. She pushed it aside, focusing on what needed to be done. But the constant barrage of hatred, the dismissal of her pain, made her realize that this fight was not only against individuals, but against a system that had never seen her as equal. And that was the most crushing part. The day of the rally arrived, and Ava stood before the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. This was no longer just a protest against one officer's abuse. It was now about everything. The systemic racism, the violence, the way she had been dismissed her entire life. She was standing in front of hundreds of people, but it felt as if the weight of an entire history was pressing down on her. Behind her, the signs waved in the air. "Justice for Max," one read. "End police brutality." The chants grew louder, the unity palpable. Ava could feel the power of the people around her, but she also felt the looming presence of those who sought to shut her down. Her heart ached. She didn't want to be the symbol for this fight. She didn't want to be the face of change, but the truth was, she was already in this fight, and there was no walking away. Her uncle, Senator Elijah Carson, stood beside her. He had fought for justice his entire life, but even he had never imagined that his niece would become the focal point of such a monumental struggle. Ava could see the worry in his eyes, the stress from the constant media attention, the pressure from his colleagues. But he wasn't backing down. He stood by her, as he always had, with a quiet strength that only made her more determined. As Ava stepped forward to speak, the crowd grew silent, waiting for her words. She could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Officer Hart anymore. This was about everything. "I stand before you today because I am tired," she began, her voice steady, though her insides trembled. "Tired of being told that my life doesn't matter. Tired of being told that the color of my skin determines my worth. Tired of seeing those who are supposed to protect us harm us instead." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in unison. "We live in a world where a black woman can't even walk her dog without being humiliated," Ava continued. "We live in a world where people like me, people who are already disadvantaged, are treated as lesser. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for every single person who has been overlooked, oppressed, or dismissed, for every single person who has been hurt by a system that was supposed to protect them." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. "I am tired of being afraid of what will happen next, afraid of being silenced. But I will not be silenced anymore. I will fight for justice. I will fight for Max. I will fight for all of us." The crowd erupted in applause, but Ava's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. She wasn't finished. Not yet. "We need to make them see us," she said, her voice growing stronger. "We need to make them understand that we will no longer accept this. We will no longer allow them to treat us like we don't matter. The truth is out there. We have to make sure it's heard." She felt the surge of energy from the crowd, the collective strength of everyone around her. But she couldn't shake the gnawing fear in the pit of her stomach. The truth was out, but that didn't mean the fight was over. The system was bigger than her. It was bigger than any single rally or protest. It was embedded in the very fabric of society, and to challenge it meant facing the full force of a system that had been in place for decades, even centuries. In the days that followed, the attacks intensified. The media doubled down on its attempts to undermine Ava, questioning her every move. "Is Ava Carson just using her uncle's position for attention?" they asked. "Is she truly a victim, or is this just another attempt to bring down the police?" They didn't stop there. Ava's family was targeted. Her uncle's political career was threatened. Her mother's name was dragged through the dirt. It was clear that this wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. They wanted to break her. They wanted to make her disappear. But it wasn't working. The more they tried to discredit her, the more determined she became. She had never been one to back down from a fight. But now, the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. It wasn't just her reputation at risk. It was her safety, her future, and the futures of all the people who were fighting alongside her. Ava felt the weight of it all. The isolation, the hatred, the constant feeling of being watched. It was all consuming. And yet she couldn't stop. She couldn't walk away from the truth. The truth had already been set in motion, and once it was out, there was no going back. The next blow came in the form of an unexpected call from Jennings. He had been silent for the past few days, and Ava hadn't heard from him since the night they had gone into hiding. When she answered the phone, his voice was frantic. "Ava, they're closing in. We need to move fast. They're preparing to charge you with inciting violence. They'll make you the villain in this story." Her heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "I've been getting reports," Jennings said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're going to make you look like the aggressor. They'll twist the narrative until you're the one at fault. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Ava's mind raced. This was it. This was what she had been waiting for, dreading, all along. They were going to turn the story on her, make her the villain, and destroy everything she had fought for. "I won't let them do that," Ava said, her voice sharp and determined. "I won't be silenced." "You need to be careful," Jennings warned. "They've already started to smear you, and they won't stop until they've ruined everything. This is bigger than just you, Ava. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." "I'm not afraid of them," Ava said, though she knew the fear was there, gnawing at her. "I've been living in fear my entire life, and I'm done." Jennings was silent for a moment, then said, "All right, let's keep pushing. We need to get the evidence out before they can bury it. Keep your head low, stay safe, but don't stop." As the call ended, Ava stood still in her apartment, staring out at the city below. She had been walking a fine line between courage and fear for so long, but now it was clearer than ever. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every single person who had ever been hurt by the system, every voice that had been silenced, every person who had been crushed under the weight of power and prejudice. And no matter how many times they tried to shut her down, she wasn't going to stop. Ava could feel the storm closing in around her. The weight of the fight had grown unbearable, a constant pressure pressing on her chest. The media was relentless. The hate-filled comments kept coming. The threats grew more intense, more personal. But it wasn't just the outside world she had to contend with. The fear inside her, that she was too weak, too small, too insignificant to bring down a system this entrenched, was becoming harder to ignore. She had fought for so long, but as the stakes grew higher, her resolve began to waver. Every step she took in this battle felt like a step further into the unknown. And as much as she wanted to keep fighting, the fear of what would come next was suffocating. Ava had become a symbol, but she hadn't signed up for this. She hadn't signed up to have her every move scrutinized. Her life turned upside down by forces much bigger than her. But as much as she tried to push the fear aside, there was no denying the truth. This was the battle of her life. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she glanced down at her phone. The latest news cycle was exploding with the accusations. The headlines were merciless. "Black activist incites violence at protest," one of the top articles read. Another said, "Ava Carson, the face of anti-police hysteria, rallies her supporters to escalate chaos." The racially charged language was everywhere, even in the subtle undercurrent of the headlines. The same tired narrative was being pushed. She was a problem. She was the one inciting division. She was the one disrupting the peace. She turned her phone off. There was no use looking at the hateful words. The stories were being spun to make her look like the villain. The very people who had been supporting her, standing by her side, were being attacked now too. The violence that had been done to her was being used against her. Her uncle's name was dragged through the dirt. Her mother's name was also being smeared, all because Ava had dared to speak out. Her skin felt tight, like it was suffocating her. She had learned a long time ago that her skin was the first thing people saw when they looked at her. But now, it felt like it was her skin that was under attack. Not her actions, not her words, but simply who she was. Being black and standing up was too much for some to bear. Her every move was scrutinized, her every action criticized. People didn't want her to exist outside of their prescribed boxes. If she was just a victim, maybe they could understand. But if she was a fighter, that was something they couldn't tolerate. The knock at her door was sharp, insistent. Ava froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her heart skipped. She moved cautiously toward the door, her hand tightening around the handle. For a moment, she considered not answering, but she knew that would only invite more suspicion. She opened it. Standing there was Detective Carter. "What are you doing here?" Ava asked, her voice guarded. She hadn't seen the detective in days, not since their last conversation. And with the way things had been escalating, she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Carter's expression was tense, her eyes scanning the room quickly, as though looking for something hidden. "They've escalated it, Ava," she said, stepping inside without invitation. "They're coming for you in every way they can." Ava frowned. "What are you talking about? The media already made me out to be the villain. I don't know how much worse they can make it." "They'll make it worse," Carter said bluntly. "They're planning to charge you with inciting violence. They'll twist the narrative so much that you'll be painted as the mastermind behind every protest that's gotten violent. They want to make sure you're not just defeated, they want you gone." Ava felt her stomach tighten. Her fight had been about exposing the truth, not about becoming the next target of the system. But it was clear now that the system was afraid of her. They were afraid of what would happen if the truth was allowed to stand. "Why are you telling me this?" Ava asked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. "Why help me? I'm just one person." "I'm telling you this because I can't let them destroy what's left of the truth," Carter said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I'm doing this because you're right, Ava. There's a system of corruption here. It's not just Hart, it's everyone protecting him. I know how this works, but I'm not backing down, and neither should you." Ava stared at the woman before her, still uncertain. She had to admit that Carter's words were unsettling. How could Carter, an officer of the law, be the one to tell her all this? Hadn't she seen enough of what the system could do? But Carter was giving her an out, a way to fight back, even when everything seemed impossible. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Ava said quietly, more to herself than to Carter. Carter shook her head. "None of us do. Not if we want to see justice." Ava swallowed hard. Her entire body felt heavy. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about everything. The system, the lies, the power that had been wielded against her and people like her for generations. If she didn't keep pushing, the whole fight would be lost, and she couldn't allow that. "I need to expose them," Ava said, the weight of her words sinking in. "I need to show everyone what's really happening, what's been happening all along. I won't stop until they're all held accountable." That night, as Ava lay in bed, the weight of the world on her chest, her thoughts kept racing. What if she was making a mistake? What if everything she had fought for was going to unravel before her? The fear of losing, of being wrong, of not being enough, gnawed at her. It was a feeling she had felt before, one that she had pushed down for years. But Ava had a choice now, one she couldn't ignore. She could keep running, keep hiding, hoping the storm would pass, or she could stand up, fight, and make sure that the truth was heard, no matter what it cost her. Max, sensing her distress, lay beside her, his soft breathing a reminder of the bond they shared. He was her protector, her constant. She had to protect him too. She had to make sure that what happened to them didn't happen to anyone else again. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let fear rule her. Ava had faced fear her entire life, from the moment she had been told she wasn't enough to the moment she had learned to walk through the world with a cane and a guide dog. This time, fear wasn't going to win. The next day, Ava returned to the rally, but this time it felt different. The streets were filled with people, but there was a heaviness in the air. The police had mobilized, setting up barricades and making sure the crowd stayed far from the city hall. There was no pretense anymore. The system was ready for her. But Ava was ready for them, too. As she stood before the crowd once more, the energy was palpable, but the reality was undeniable. This wasn't just a march for justice. This was a war for the truth, a war against the silence that had for too long shielded those in power. "I've been told to back down," Ava said, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "I've been told that I'm not enough, that the truth doesn't matter, that I'm just one voice. But I'm here to tell you, I'm not just one voice. We are 1,000 voices. We are the people who have been silenced for too long, and we are not afraid anymore." The crowd roared in approval, their voices rising in unison. For the first time in weeks, Ava felt the power of the people. She wasn't alone. She didn't need to be afraid anymore. This was bigger than her. This was bigger than any one officer, any one person. This was a fight for justice, a fight for truth. But as she stood there, the police made their move. Ava stood at the front of the crowd, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The rally had grown exponentially, with thousands of people now gathering, chanting, holding signs demanding justice, chanting for the world to finally see the truth. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked out over the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, all united by a common cause. For a moment, she felt a rush of hope surge within her. This was it. This was what she had been fighting for. But then the reality hit her like a cold wave. The system that she had dared to challenge wasn't going to stand idly by. They were watching, waiting for her to slip up, waiting for her to falter. And when she did, they would pounce. The police were already on the other side of the barricades, their presence ominous. Riot gear, armored vests, and helmets glinted in the harsh light of the afternoon sun. They had been preparing for this moment. Ava knew it. They weren't here to de-escalate. They were here to send a message. Her uncle, Senator Elijah Carson, stood beside her, his face etched with concern. "Ava, this is getting out of hand. We need to be careful. This could turn violent." Ava shook her head, determination in her eyes. "I can't back down now, Uncle Elijah. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than us. It's bigger than Hart. It's about every single person who has been treated like less. I won't stop until they hear us." "I know," he said, his voice tight. "But I'm afraid that what's coming next, it won't just be words. It'll be real violence." Ava turned to face him, her jaw set. "Let them bring it. They've been trying to silence me for weeks. They think they can bury the truth. But the truth is already out there, and I won't stop until it's heard." The crowd behind her surged with energy. People were shouting slogans, waving their signs, and chanting for justice. Ava felt the fire of their words burning within her. She had stood up for herself once, but now she was standing up for them, for everyone who had been broken by this system, for everyone who had been silenced. As the chants grew louder, Ava saw the first sign of the officers moving in. They were methodical, marching in formation, their eyes scanning the crowd. Ava could see the tension building. They weren't just here to keep the peace. They were here to intimidate, to dominate. The police had begun to form a line in front of the barricades. The heavy hum of their radios and the clanking of their gear created a sense of unease. The protesters shifted nervously, but Ava stood firm. She could feel her heart racing, but she wouldn't back down. She couldn't. Then, the officer in charge stepped forward. Officer Hart. She knew it was him before she even saw his face. The sneer, the arrogance, the look in his eyes that told her everything she needed to know. The man who had kicked Max, who had laughed in her face, was standing just yards away from her, his uniform pressed and perfect, his demeanor cold. "Move aside," he barked, his voice cutting through the crowd. "This is an unlawful assembly. You are obstructing justice." Ava didn't flinch. "This isn't your justice, Hart. This is the justice that belongs to the people who have been silenced, the people you've hurt. This is about accountability, and you will answer for what you've done." Hart's eyes narrowed, his face twisting into a cruel sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero? Just another angry black woman trying to make noise in a world that doesn't want to hear you. You think anyone cares about your story? About the dog? You're nothing. You're just a pawn in a game you don't understand." Ava's hands clenched into fists. Every word he spoke, every insult, felt like a physical blow, but she wouldn't let him see her break. She couldn't. Not now. You don't get it, do you? Ava's voice was low, controlled. You and people like you think that by calling us angry or problematic, you can keep us quiet. But we're not angry because of some inconvenience. We're angry because our lives, our bodies, our very existence has been used as a punching bag for far too long. You don't get to silence us anymore. Hart's eyes flashed with fury, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded to his officers. It was clear. They were ready to escalate. They were ready to make their move. The moment the signal was given, the police charged. The air turned thick with tension. The first push sent the front line of the protesters stumbling backward. The sound of riot shields slamming together, the sharp orders from the officers, and the screams from the crowd filled the space. Ava was pushed backward, but she stood firm. The noise was deafening, but she pushed forward. She had to. She had to stand her ground. There was no going back now. But then, the first blow came. An officer, moving too quickly, shoved a protester to the ground, and the scene quickly descended into chaos. Ava felt her breath catch in her throat as she saw a young woman nearby, who had been standing beside her, get shoved to the pavement. The woman cried out, but the officers didn't stop. They didn't care. Ava's heart raced. She could hear the chants turning into cries for help. The atmosphere shifted from one of unity to one of desperation. She could feel the violence building, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She watched as officers grabbed people from the crowd, pulling them away, slamming them to the ground. Some of them were just children, young people who were here for the first time, just trying to make their voices heard. "Help! Help!" someone screamed from the front of the crowd. Ava turned to see a young man on the ground, his hands raised, trying to shield himself from the blows of a police baton. "Stay back!" Hart shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay down, or we will escalate this." Ava's blood boiled. They had always been trained to escalate, to push harder, to humiliate. But now, they had pushed too far. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This wasn't just about Hart. This was about something much bigger. This was about the system that allowed him to do this to her, to do this to all of them. "You're not going to win," Hart sneered again, seeing her standing tall among the chaos, not backing down. "People like you don't get to make the rules. People like you are the problem." Ava felt something inside her snap. She stepped forward, her voice rising above the noise. "We are not your problem. We are the solution. We are not going to be silenced. You cannot break us." Ava felt the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She didn't know whether they were tears of rage, pain, or something deeper. But as she stood in the midst of the chaos, the anger boiled over, propelling her forward. Her voice rang out, clear and strong, shaking the very air around her. "This is about truth. This is about justice. And it's about time you learned that we're not afraid anymore." The officers halted for just a moment, taken aback by the defiance in her voice. It wasn't just the protesters they feared. It was the strength of the movement. It was the truth, finally demanding to be heard. And they knew they couldn't shut it down. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, Ava felt like they might actually win. The night had descended over the city, heavy and thick, as though the sky itself was holding its breath. Ava could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the heat of the battle she had been fighting for weeks now, turning into a pressure that seemed to seep into her bones. The rally had been both a victory and a warning. The message was loud and clear. The people were angry, but the system was prepared to retaliate. It was late, and the noise of the protests had long faded into the background of her thoughts. Her apartment was silent, save for the soft rustle of papers strewn across the table. The flickering light of her laptop illuminated her face as she sifted through the piles of news stories, petitions, and interviews that had been conducted in the wake of the rally. For the first time, she found herself questioning everything. Had she done enough? Would the voices of those who had rallied behind her ever be heard? Or would they simply be drowned out by the powerful forces that had worked tirelessly to silence them? The thought was crushing. As the media began to scrutinize every word she spoke, the weight of the racial dynamics around her became all the more apparent. It wasn't just about Officer Hart or even about the abuse Max had suffered. It was about the larger narrative that was trying to take shape around her. She was labelled, categorized, angry, radical, too vocal. The media outlets and many of the public had quickly taken the side of the police, painting the rally as an overreaction to a small incident. The ugliness of systemic racism seeped into every corner of the narrative. But Ava wasn't ready to accept that. She couldn't. The next day, as Ava walked through the city, her heart heavy with the pressure she was facing, she caught sight of a familiar face. It was Tanya, one of the activists who had been with her from the very beginning. Tanya had been by her side at the rallies, marching in the front lines, speaking out alongside Ava when things got heated. But today, there was a look in her eyes that made Ava stop in her tracks. "Are you okay?" Ava asked, her voice gentle. "You look different." Tanya smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, just trying to keep things together." She paused, glancing around, as if making sure no one was listening. "I wanted to talk to you about what's coming next. We need to prepare for what's ahead. The backlash is only going to get worse." Ava nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. She had expected this. The backlash had already begun. "They're going to try to discredit us," Tanya continued, her voice tight with frustration. "The media's already doing it. They're calling us troublemakers. They're calling you a radical. It's not just the police anymore. It's the entire system. And they'll keep coming for you, for all of us." Ava's chest tightened at Tanya's words. She had known it wouldn't be easy. The police weren't going to back down. But hearing it from Tanya, someone who had been in the trenches with her, made it feel even more real. She had already seen what the media was saying about her, the constant ridicule, the casual racism embedded in every criticism. She had seen how the narrative was being shaped, how they had twisted her story into something it wasn't. But Ava wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been affected by this system. The people who had been ignored, dismissed, and dehumanized for far too long. She couldn't afford to give up now, no matter how hard it became. "We have to keep pushing," Ava said, her voice steady, despite the fear simmering just below the surface. "We can't let them drown us out. The truth is on our side. We can't let them erase it." Tanya nodded, a fierce determination in her eyes. "We'll stand with you, Ava. We'll keep fighting. But we need to be careful. They're watching us. Every move we make, every word we say, we need to stay ahead of them." Later that evening, as Ava sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on Tanya's words, she received a phone call. It was from her uncle, Senator Elijah Carson. His voice, usually calm and collected, was now tinged with a quiet urgency. "Ava, I need you to listen to me," he said, his tone serious. "Things are escalating. I've been getting pressure from every direction. The police union, city officials. They're all trying to push this under the rug. They want to make you disappear. The media has already started painting you as the problem, but they won't stop there." Ava felt a lump form in her throat. "I know, Uncle. I've seen it. But I can't stop now. People are counting on me. I can't turn my back on this." "I know," he said. "But you have to be careful. They will try to ruin you. They'll drag your name through the mud. They'll twist everything you've said. They'll make you out to be the villain in this story. They'll try to make you look like a criminal." Ava's fists clenched at the thought. The idea of being painted as the villain, as the problem, was something she had feared. It wasn't enough that she was being vilified. Now they were trying to erase her story completely. They were going to make her fight for every inch of ground she had gained. "But we can't let them win, Uncle," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This fight is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us. I can't let them silence us." Her uncle sighed on the other end of the line. "I know. I've been working behind the scenes, trying to get the information you need. But it's getting dangerous. They're pulling out all the stops. If we don't act fast, they'll bury it all. They'll bury you. They'll bury Max. I won't let them," Ava said firmly. "We've come too far to stop now." The next few days were a blur of phone calls, press conferences, and strategy meetings. Ava's fight had gone from a single act of defiance to a full-scale movement. And with that movement came the full weight of the system trying to shut it down. But the pressure wasn't just coming from the outside. Ava could feel it within herself. The exhaustion, the frustration, the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. She had become the face of the movement, the symbol of resistance. But with that came the relentless scrutiny. She couldn't walk down the street without feeling the weight of every eye on her, every whisper, every judgment. It wasn't just the police anymore. It was the entire world. Ava had to confront something more terrifying than the fear of being erased. It was the fear of losing herself in the process, of becoming so consumed by the fight that she forgot why she started it in the first place. But as she sat in her apartment, surrounded by the chaos of it all, she remembered something her uncle had told her. The truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how much darkness tries to swallow it. And with that thought, Ava found the strength to keep going. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't. The city had grown colder in the days following the rally, as though it too had sensed the shift in the air. Ava could feel it, the walls of pressure closing in, the weight of her decisions bearing down on her at every turn. Every protest, every chant had become a part of her life now. The fight for justice, for her truth, had become her world. But the battle had shifted. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It wasn't about one person's humiliation. It was about the very system that had built its foundation on inequality, on the backs of people like her. And Ava was the one who was threatening to expose it all. It wasn't just the police anymore. It wasn't just Officer Hart who had first set this entire fight into motion. The system was fighting back with everything it had. The accusations were growing fiercer, the hate more violent. They were no longer using their power simply to maintain control. Now they were using it to bury her, to make her the problem, the villain in the story they were telling. The media began running headlines like "Radical Activist Calls for Defiance," "The Mask of a Victim Unveiled," and the worst, Ava Carson, inciting chaos in the streets. She had been painted as the enemy. The protests she had helped spark were no longer seen as cries for justice. They were labeled as disruptions and dangerous uprisings. The overwhelming narrative that followed her was that of a dangerous, angry woman, stirring up hatred and division. The insults weren't just confined to the media. Social media had become a toxic wasteland of slurs and threats. "Just another entitled black girl making trouble," one post read. "She's nothing but a criminal hiding behind her uncle's name," another claimed. Ava had read them all. She had tried to ignore them at first, but after so many days of being targeted, the weight of it all became too much. The casual racism, the dismissive tone in every accusation, had started to take its toll. She wasn't just being painted as a villain. She was being made to feel as though she was less human, less worthy. Ava sat in her apartment, staring at the glow of her laptop screen, the words flashing in front of her eyes. Her hands were clenched into fists, trembling as she scrolled through the latest messages. The pain of seeing herself torn apart in such a public way, of having her own struggles turned into a spectacle for others to mock, was unbearable. She had fought so hard to get here, to tell the truth, to show people the reality of what she had endured, what so many others had endured. And now it felt like the world was trying to erase her. "Why are you doing this to me?" Ava whispered to herself, staring into the reflection in the screen. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to be heard." It was then that her uncle, Senator Elijah Carson, called. His voice, though calm, held a note of frustration she hadn't heard before. "Ava, we need to talk." She had grown accustomed to his voice, but today it sounded different. Weary, burdened. "What is it, Uncle?" "I've just come from a meeting with the mayor's office. They're pushing for a full investigation into you, into the rallies, into the way you've handled yourself. They're calling for you to be charged with inciting violence, disturbing the peace, and worse. They've already started building a case against you, Ava." Ava's heart sank. She had known this moment would come. She had known that this fight would take everything from her. But hearing the words out loud was like a punch to the gut. "What do we do?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. We keep fighting, Elijah replied, his voice steady. We keep pushing forward. We cannot let them erase what you've started. But we have to be careful now. We have to make sure we're strategic. I don't know how much more I can take, Uncle, Ava confessed, her voice trembling for the first time in months. Every day it's getting harder. The hatred is suffocating. They're turning everyone against me, and I'm losing control of this. Elijah sighed, a deep, resigned sound that spoke volumes. The hardest part is always holding on when it feels like you're losing. But the truth is with you, Ava, and they can't take that away. Ava closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She had spent her entire life holding on to the belief that if she did the right thing, if she spoke out, the truth would set her free. But now, it felt like the truth was being buried under mountains of lies, under the weight of a system determined to protect itself at all costs. She had to keep going. She had to. A few days later, Ava found herself standing before a crowd again, a sea of people gathered in the streets. The protests had grown larger, more powerful. But the police presence was overwhelming. Officers lined the streets, barricades were set up, and helicopters hovered above, watching every movement from the sky. It was clear. This wasn't just a protest anymore. This was a battle for their very right to exist in a society that had long ignored them. As Ava stood at the front of the crowd, her heart pounded. This wasn't just another rally. This was the last stand. She knew that if they couldn't push through here, if they couldn't break through the walls that had been built against them, they might never get another chance. The stakes had never been higher. The chant rose from the crowd. Justice for all! Justice for all! The words echoed through the streets, a collective cry for change. But even as the chant grew louder, Ava could feel the tension in the air. She could feel the eyes of the officers upon her, the weight of their gaze piercing her like arrows. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the crowd. The officers had begun to advance. The line had been drawn. Ava knew what would come next. The same violence that had been part of every rally, every protest. The same force that had been used to silence them before. But this time, Ava wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to back down. She stepped forward, her voice loud and strong as she shouted to the crowd. This is our time. We will not be silenced. We will not be erased. We will stand no matter what. The police didn't wait. They moved forward, pushing the crowd back with their shields, their batons, their force. The scene was chaos. People screamed. The sound of riot shields clashing echoed in the streets. Ava felt the heat rise in her chest as the fear began to creep in. She had been here before. She had seen the violence, the anger, the dehumanization, and yet she stood her ground. But as the officers moved closer, something unexpected happened. A shift, a ripple through the crowd. The people, once afraid, now stood united, their voices rising together, drowning out the sound of the police. The sheer force of their unity, their will to be heard, was unstoppable. They were no longer the silenced. They were no longer the invisible. In the following days, Ava's story reached new heights. The police tried to control the narrative, but the truth had already spread far and wide. People were listening. The voices of the oppressed were being heard. Ava had done what they thought was impossible. She had ignited a fire that they couldn't put out, and though the battle wasn't over, and the road ahead was still filled with challenges, Ava knew that she had won something bigger than just a fight for justice. She had won the power of the truth. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What do you think about Ava's journey and the struggles she faces? Have you ever experienced racism in your own life? Your opinions and experiences are incredibly important to us, and we truly value each and every one of you for taking the time to engage with us. If you've been following along and enjoying the story, please consider subscribing and giving a like. Your support means the world to us. We hope you have a wonderful day ahead. To let us know you've been listening till the end, leave a comment with the phrase, "The truth cannot be silenced." We look forward to hearing from you.